Who do you think was the first serial killer in history? Jack the Ripper? The Axeman of New Orleans? Maybe someone even older, Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess? What if I told you that history's first documented serial killer wasn't a nameless shadow lurking in the dark, but a war hero, a nobleman, a man who once stood among kings? His name was Gilles de Rais. Gilles de Rais was no ordinary knight. He was no ordinary commander. He was one of the wealthiest men in France, a noble with lands stretching farther than the eye could see. But it wasn't his riches that made him feared. It was his mind. From the moment he could hold a sword, he was trained to be something more than just another lord. Strategy, war, politics, he mastered them all before he was old enough to rule. At 16, he commanded his first battle. By 24, his enemies spoke his name in whispers. But war does something to men, and Gilles de Rais was not untouched. Gilles de Rais should have been one of history's greatest warriors. He fought alongside Joan of Arc. He led men into battles that shaped the fate of a nation. He was celebrated, honored, and given the highest military title France could bestow, Marshal of France. His name should have stood alongside history's greatest heroes. But today there are no statues, no monuments. His victories are forgotten. Because the truth about Gilles de Rais was so monstrous that history itself tried to erase him. So why did France try to forget him? Why did a man who should have been remembered as one of history's greatest warriors become one of its most horrifying secrets? A man does not become a legend by standing still. He rises through blood, through fire, through the weight of war itself. Gilles de Rais did not just witness history, he shaped it. He was brilliant, fearless, the kind of commander who could turn the tide of battle with a single maneuver. And for a time, he was France's greatest weapon. The year was 1429. France was crumbling. The English forces had carved through the land like a plague, taking everything in their path. The people had lost hope. The nobles had lost faith. And then, out of nowhere, came a girl, Joan of Arc. She claimed to be sent by God, a peasant with no army, no title, just a divine mission to save France. At first, the court laughed at her. But one man didn't. One man saw something in her that no one else did. Gilles de Rais. He stood beside her when no one else would. When she led troops into battle, he was at her right hand, ensuring her victories were not just won, but decisive, brutal, and absolute. The English had dug themselves into Orléans, a city they believed was impenetrable, a city they were ready to hold for as long as it took. But they didn't count on Joan, and they didn't count on Gilles de Rais. Together, they stormed the city's defenses, not with brute force alone, but with precision, with strategy, with the kind of brilliance that turns soldiers into legends. They cut through the enemy like fire through dry grass. Gilles was not just another knight, he was the mind behind the storm. And in less than 10 days, Orléans was free. The victory shook the world, and for his part, Gilles de Rais was named Marshal of France, the highest honor a commander could receive. He had everything: power, prestige, the trust of a woman the people now called a saint. He should have been remembered as one of the greatest warriors in history. For a year, he fought beside Joan of Arc. Through every battle, every impossible victory, he was there. Not just a soldier, not just an ally, her protector. She was more than a military leader to him. She was proof that something greater than war could exist. That maybe, just maybe, there was a higher purpose to all of this. But in war, belief is not enough, and saints do not always win. In 1430, Joan was captured by the Burgundians and sold to the English. She was accused of heresy, imprisoned, and forced to stand trial. But the verdict was never in question. The church, the English crown, and even some of her own countrymen had already decided her fate. Gilles de Rais was one of the most powerful military commanders in France, but he did nothing to stop it. Because he couldn't. By the time Joan was captured, France had distanced itself from her. The same king she had helped crown, Charles VII, did nothing to save her. If Gilles had tried to intervene, he would have been defying both the French court and the Catholic Church. He would have been branded a traitor. He also had no command. After the victory at Orléans, he was rewarded with titles and land, but he was no longer leading troops. He was a noble, not a soldier, and without the king's backing, he had no army to fight for her. And then there was the question he never spoke aloud. If Joan had been sent by God, why didn't he save her? He had seen her win battles that should have been impossible. He had watched her rally men who had already accepted death. But in the end, none of it mattered. The English still won. The church still condemned her. The fire still took her. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was burned alive. Gilles de Rais did not ride to her rescue. He did not challenge the verdict. He did not fight. And after that day, he never would again. He abandoned the battlefield. He withdrew from court. He locked himself away inside his castles, spending his vast fortune on something no one could understand. And soon, they would learn that whatever part of Gilles de Rais had died with Joan of Arc, something else had taken its place. Gilles de Rais had lost his faith in God long ago, ever since Joan of Arc had burned, ever since the church had abandoned her. If God would not answer him, then maybe something else would. After a while, things inside his estate was different. Some talked about the rituals, the servants that spoke in hushed voices and avoided certain hallways. They ignored the sounds they weren't supposed to hear, pretend not to hear the screaming. Then the missing children starting. People blamed war, blamed the roads, blamed bad luck. But it happened again, and again, and again. No bodies, no ransom, no clues. Families searched, but there was nowhere to search. The missing children had simply vanished. At first, the villagers whispered about bandits, maybe wild animals. But the ones who worked inside the castle, the ones who lived in the shadow of Gilles de Rais, they knew better, because they had seen things. Bones, too small to belong to an animal, burned in the fireplace. Bloodstains that weren't there yesterday but gone by morning. Rooms that had doors one day, and nothing but stone the next. The servants whispered about the locked rooms, the underground chambers, the missing children. But still, no one spoke out. Because in France, a noble was above suspicion. A war hero, even more so. No one accused men like Gilles de Rais of crimes like these, until the day someone did. The first real challenge to Gilles de Rais' untouchable status came not from grieving families, nor from terrified villagers, but from a dispute over money. The church was after him for violating its authority, seizing a religious property he had no right to take. It was a legal matter, not a criminal one. But once they started digging, they found something far worse. Local villagers spoke of the disappearances. Parents of missing children testified that their sons and daughters had last been seen near his estates. Faced with the authority of the church, the servants started to talk. One by one, they revealed what had been happening inside the castle, what they had seen, what they had been forced to do. At first, the court refused to believe it. How could they? The accusations were impossible, unspeakable. But the more the testimonies stacked up, the harder it became to ignore. It had started slowly, they said. One child, then another, then another. At first, no one noticed. The roads were dangerous. The war had left people desperate. Children went missing all the time. But then the pattern emerged. They all vanished near his lands. They were all last seen speaking to his men. They were all promised something: food, money, a warm place to sleep. And they never came back. And then came the question that no one wanted to ask: how many children? Some said 50, others 100. Some whispered that it was more, far more. Hundreds of children taken into the castle and never seen again. The youngest, no more than 6. The oldest, barely 16. Boys, mostly. Lured in, trapped, and then gone. Some were strangled, not in rage, but slowly, methodically, so he could watch the life leave their eyes. Some were stabbed, not to kill immediately, but to see how long a body could last before it finally gave in. Some were made to believe they would be spared, only to have their hope ripped away at the last second, because he wanted to see the exact moment their fear turned into despair. And some, Some were burned alive, just to see what it would feel like. The servants tried to explain what they had seen, but there were no words for it. The bloodstains that appeared overnight, only to be scrubbed away by morning. The rooms that were locked then suddenly sealed shut, as if whatever had happened inside was too horrific to ever be uncovered. The nights when the air was thick with the smell of something burning, but the kitchen fires had long gone cold. And then, finally, Gilles de Rais himself stood up, and he confessed to all of it. Every child, every death, every crime. Gilles de Rais wasn't just indulging in his own darkness. He believed he was doing something greater. According to his own confession and the testimonies of those who had served him, the murders were not simply acts of cruelty. They were experiments. Because Gilles de Rais believed that suffering had power, that terror could be a force, that death itself, violent, painful, prolonged, was the key to unlocking something no mortal was ever meant to touch. He had hired alchemists, men who claimed they could summon demons, grant power, extend life itself. They told him that pain was a tool, that suffering was a key to forces beyond human comprehension, and he listened. They promised him wealth, power, knowledge, the return of the fortune he had squandered, the return of the glory he had lost, and maybe even the one thing he could never admit he wanted, a second chance at fate, a way to undo the past. But no matter how many lives he took, no matter how many he tortured, nothing ever came. But he never stopped, because by then it wasn't about wealth anymore. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about summoning anything at all. It was just about the killing. On October 25th, 1440, the verdict was made official. Death. There would be no drawn-out imprisonment, no years of waiting in the shadows of a cell. He was to die the next day, burned alive, the same fate Joan of Arc had suffered 9 years earlier. The irony was not lost on those who had fought beside him. After his death, France wiped him from history. His lands were stripped from his family. His castles were abandoned, left to crumble under the weight of what had happened inside their walls. His name, once spoken in admiration, became a curse, a warning. There were no monuments, no statues, no tributes to the warrior he had once been. Gilles de Rais, the Marshal of France, the right hand of Joan of Arc, the man who had once saved a nation, had become a ghost. Gilles de Rais is remembered as one of history's first serial killers. His name was erased, his victories forgotten, his legend twisted into horror. But what if history got it wrong? What if the man who fought beside Joan of Arc wasn't a monster at all? His trial was led by the Church, an institution known for using heresy accusations to eliminate powerful enemies. His wealth was seized by the Duke of Brittany, who had everything to gain from his conviction. And his confession, given only after his servants testified first, under threat of torture. There were no mass graves, no physical evidence, only words. So was Gilles de Rais a sadistic serial killer? Or was he the victim of a witch hunt framed for crimes he never committed? The truth is buried in history, but one thing is certain. Monsters are not always born. Sometimes they are made.